Across the world, around 300 million people experience anxiety disorders. Around 280 million people experience depression, and the instances of suicide and self harm have gone through the roof since 2010. Unfortunately, Gen Z contributes to a large percentage of these numbers. Mental health issues are a very real thing, and these issues amongst Gen Z are like a modern day epidemic. There are still various cohorts of people who don't believe in this and they think it's all excuses to not work hard and deal with life. It's not. There is a lot of context and a lot more nuance behind this Gen Z epidemic. And that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. Hello, everybody. My name is Lakshan, your host for this episode.
And I am Goldie, and this is episode 16 of Mind the Gen Gap podcast.
This episode is very heavily inspired by the work of Jonathan Haidt and his book, The Anxious Generation, which was introduced to me by Goldie, of all people in the world, where he expands on this central claim of his that the two trends, overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world, are the major reasons why Gen Z became the anxious generation. And because this episode addresses two topics that Goldie and I are extremely passionate about, Gen Z and mental health, the tone of this episode is going to be a little more serious than usual. We'll be breaking this episode down into three segments. The first one being Gen Z, their relationship with mental health and the data around that. The second one being the root causes behind this epidemic. And the third segment being how we can actually fix this. Let's first of all start off understanding Gen Z and their relationship with mental health and what the data around this actually says. Now, the World Health Organization, WHO, defines mental health as a state of mental well being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. So there are four parts to this definition. The first part being the ability to cope with the stresses of life. Second one being able to realize their abilities. Third one being learning well and working well. And the fourth one being contributing to their community. And unfortunately, Gen Z in particular are struggling to align with every single one of the elements in this definition. They are not able to cope with the stresses of life. They are not able to realize their abilities. They are not able to learn well and work well. And they are not able to contribute to their community. And these are not just my thoughts, because I'm sure you've all seen it for yourselves as well. And for those of you who are skeptical about what I'm saying, there is data to back this up. According to a Gallup survey, nearly 50% of Gen Z have reported that they often or always feel anxious. Since 2010, the rates of depression amongst teens has increased by around 150% on average between boys and girls. By the way, an increase of 150% basically means that the number of people has increased to 2.5 times what it was in 2010. Anxiety also has increased by about 140% amongst 18 to 25-year-olds, by about 100% amongst 26 to 34-year-olds, and by around 50% amongst 35 to 49-year-olds. And all of this is from 2010 onwards. Now, the reason that I mentioned the demographic between 35 and 49 is because they're typically the parents of Gen Z, and anxiety has been increasing for them as well. I won't touch on that aspect of it because that is for another episode, which Goldie will be doing next week. Now, why am I emphasizing this whole 2010 thing so much? Well, because that's when the iPhone and smartphones in general really started getting massive adoption and social media started to really take off. And I don't think any of this is a coincidence. Now, while these numbers are mostly from the West, it shows up similarly in the rest of the world as well, because Gen Z is the first truly global generation. Now, Goldie, I know I spoke a lot, but it's because there is so much to say about all this, as I'm sure you have quite a few things to say yourself. And I was introduced to this book, as I already said earlier, by you and Jonathan Haidt's work in general. What's your take in all of this?
Well, firstly, well done on such a crisp introduction. I was tentatively thinking of so many things, but you've really, brought together a framework that's explained our audiences really well, in a good summary, what this generation is all about, the anxious generation. And whilst everything that you've said resonates deeply with me, and I 100% am on board with the mental health crisis for Gen Z, also the nuanced figures for millennial stroke Gen X parents, because they enter into that bracket that you mentioned. I want to go back before the Anxious Generation book and actually address a small sort of sidebar. Let's sidebar for a minute, because Jonathan Haidt was inspired to write The Anxious Generation thanks to a book he wrote before that, which perhaps I don't think I've mentioned to you, but I must take this moment to address this, because the rest of what you'll tell us in the episode will come from the main book here. But where did this all begin? And how am I interpreting the data? Well, it comes from the book Coddling of the American Mind, which is what he co-authored with Greg Lukianoff before writing The Anxious Generation. And Haidt and Lukianoff argue, and again, they present data and say that the ideas of discourage in college campuses on, speaking about pervasive areas of idealism and having to sort of suppress certain cultural aspects of dialogue. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about there are certain ways in which we're bringing up children in education, and societal attitudes have actually contributed to the rise in anxiety, because the authors say that there are three main ideas that they believe are undermining in a very big way the resilience of today's youth. And resilience is a big concept of solid mental health, which is what you mentioned in the definition that the World Health Organization gives. So their belief is that the youth are more fragile because they are being encouraged to stay in this bracket of what they call safetyism. Safetyism being not prioritizing emotional comfort over intellectual challenge, dialing down the idea of activism, which is very present on campuses, especially in the US. All these arguments are contributing to the mindset of the youth, and thus making them more fragile, debilitating their mental health in a very sort of subconscious manner. So I think it's very important to bring this into context, because it may be a small component, but it's a contributor in their overall way that they frame things and have opinions about things. And then this can lead to the way they cope, because they are encouraged to stay in the safety brackets of not saying this or the other. Even this idea, which I'm going to say the following thing, it's very disruptive, but this whole idea of gender identity as well. Everything is acceptable. And of course, that opens a whole other can of worms, but it's the reality of what we are living today, which could be, great content for another episode. And I want to add to that one more thing. If we are going to speak about the anxious generation and how they are not able to cope with the factors that are contributing, which are overprotection and the underprotection in the virtual world, this is all taking us in the direction of technology, which I'm sure you'll cover in a bit. But when we are overexposed and underprotected in the virtual world, it also means that your sleep is affected. And sleep is a huge contributor to mental health, which I think even Jonathan hasn't addressed as importantly and with so much depth as maybe it needs in that context.
Yeah. What you mentioned about referencing the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Again, both these books I'm only familiar with primarily because of the LinkedIn post that you had put out a few months ago. And I was very fascinated by the way you summarize some of the ideas in those posts from these books. And as you were sharing this thing about safetyism, I'm compelled to ask you, just to make sure that I understood correctly. Do you mean things? Has it got anything to do with this idea of cancel culture?
Yes, exactly. So it's about the importance of free speech and the need to engage with opposing viewpoints to foster a healthier, more open-minded society. Wokeism, which has only come in the last 20 years, I think, or even less, I would say. If you're a woke person online, what does that make you? Somebody who is has always got an opinion about everything. And this does create anxiety, even for those who are reading those comments. If all we have to do is go to a woke post and then read all the comments that come below.
Yeah, it's. I think it's that when people are in constant attack and defense mode, the fight and flight mode, as we say, I think that's. It's like you're constantly there, and what you mentioned about technology playing a part in this, and sleep being this great disruptor. We before we started recording this episode, we spoke about sleep, right? How
Yeah,
you are operating on 5 hours of sleep, and how it's making you feel irritated or agitated or
yeah,
really on edge. So if
right.
that's the case for us who are, say, adults, I mean, when you're growing up, your childhood, when you just sacrifice your sleep, it's going to take a toll. And I think that is one aspect I wanted to cover in the second segment of this episode, which is where we touch upon the root causes behind this epidemic, as I call it. So, as we spoke about technology and social media being this thing that created this massive shift, but the root cause is a little bit different. According to Jonathan Haidt, the root cause of this for this epidemic is basically the decline of play-based childhood and the rise of phone-based childhood. I want to repeat that again. It is the decline of play-based childhood and the rise of phone-based childhood. Now, what does that mean? Basically, people who were born before 1997, including yours truly, experienced a fairly different childhood compared to the ones born after that. For example, we spent our childhoods playing with people, right? Free play, where we learned to interact with other people, experienced the ability to adapt to various cultures, being able to connect with one another, synchronize, and take turns when we interact with each other. We spent our pubescent years doing all sorts of things, rebelling to whatever our parents say or authority says, taking risks, doing experimenting with adult things, as they say. And we happen to learn a lot from those real world experiences. The simple example I like to give is um, we basically put our hand in the fire and learned that it's hot, it burns my hand, I'm not going to put my hand in the fire. That is the way we went about learning from our childhood experiences. But the ones who were born after 1997 had a vastly different experience. Their pubescent years were spent online and being boxed in at home, something that Goldie you mentioned earlier in this episode. And that created something that Jonathan calls the four foundational harms. First one being social deprivation, second one being sleep deprivation, which again we covered, Goldie, we touched upon rather. The third one being attention fragmentation, and the fourth one being addiction. I know these sound like big words, I'm going to simplify it for you. So basically, a phone based childhood, which again is fairly straightforward, it's where you spend your childhood with the phone in your hands, leads to a massive drop in the amount of time that you spend with your friends in a face to face setting. Apparently, since this is what data says, between 2012 to 2019, the amount of time that you spend with your friends in a one on one setting, face to face setting, has dropped by close to half. And obviously, this shows up in Gen Z's social skills. And now this leads to a massive drop in the quality and quantity of sleep. Again, the graphs are just talking about how, as time has gone on, the amount of sleep that adolescents get is at least half an hour on average less than what it used to be back in 2010. And now, because of a lack of good quality sleep and quantity of sleep, they are always going to be on edge because they are constantly engaged all the time, and they have massive levels of FOMO, the fear of missing out. And that's the reason why when they go to bed, the last thing they look at is their phone. When they wake up, the first thing they look at is their phone because they want to know, what did I miss out on when I was asleep. And this leads to something that a lot of us complain about when it comes to Gen Z, which is their inability to focus on one thing for too long. And this is, of course, because of TikTok and Reels and how quickly technology itself is evolving. We are in a video based medium of consuming content, and the editing styles are so fast. They cut so quickly. And also, your phone notifications are going off every few seconds from every app because everybody wants to grab your attention. And of course, that's the last element of addiction, which is a result of all of these companies finding ways to hook children into heavily using their products through frequent dopamine hits. Goldie, in the beginning of this episode, I stated Jonathan's claim about, overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world, something that you also mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think what you had touched upon with the coddling of the American mind helps us with expanding and exploring more about the overprotection in the real world aspect, because I feel like we've touched quite a bit on the virtual world. I would love to hear your thoughts on the real world aspect of this statement.
Yeah. It's interesting because although we will address this in a much more deep sense in next week's episode, there is a good moment for it to be addressed right now. And this all kind of goes back to, let me take you back to the 80s. Okay. Now, what happened in the 80s? There was this thing called the end of play-based childhood, which you briefly mentioned at the beginning of today's episode. What did this mean? This basically meant that the parents were suddenly very scared about their children being out in the open, playing in on street corners, because abduction levels started to rise. Okay, so kidnappings had never been an issue, especially in the US, but suddenly in the 80s, this did take a very large sort of spotlight in the media. And so this led a lot of parents to becoming extremely overprotective over their children and keeping them more indoors versus, outdoors. A lot of us who were born in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, myself included, I very clearly remember spending a lot of time outdoors. But then there was this moment that came in the 90s that suddenly it was no longer safe to be outdoors after a certain time. And we'd be encouraged to stay indoors. So this was the beginning of what ended play-based childhood. Of course, back then there were no phones, obviously, in the 90s. So we did other things. We played games indoors. So this has then also had an impact on the style of parenting that has emerged from this end of play-based childhood, which came about, interestingly, in about the 1980s again, which was called helicopter parenting. Okay. And what happened here was parents were micromanaging their kids. So all the decisions that were being made for them were being, executed by the parents, which meant that children were at less liberty to make decisions, or, like you said, make mistakes or learn from your mistakes. And as we know, when you don't fall and rise, the famous lines, you don't really become resilient. Yeah. If you are resilient, it's because you have gone through adversity, basic coaching science. So if you have not gone through adversity, how are you expected to become resilient and learn from your mistakes, as we call them? We don't call them failures, do we, in coaching? We call them mistakes. So this is how, overprotection in the real world has played a part. And there's so much more I can talk about that, but it's kind of giving us a glimpse into what came later. And after helicopter parenting came other forms of parenting, which I will touch on next week. But that's for next week's episode. Yeah.
So, what I'm understanding from what you're saying, Goldie, is that the overprotection in the real world, I mean, for the most part, there was some, say, validity in parents wanting to do that because of, as you mentioned, abductions and crime being on the rise. But again, to go from protecting, it seems like they've gone towards the overprotecting side, where they're,
Yeah.
doing it at every level. And as you said, because resilience was not taught, it's showing up in the way that Gen Z are dealing or not dealing with the stresses of life, so to say. Again, like you said, we'll touch upon this extensively in next episode. I'm actually very excited for that one because I feel like I'm going to learn so much, so I can't wait for that. But before we get to the next episode, I want to talk about what we can do about all these issues that Gen Z are currently facing in this episode. Now, while all of these that issues that we discussed are very real, it's not the end of the world yet. We can still do something about it. Now, a lot of us will have plenty of ideas for what tech companies can do and for what governments can do in terms of taking initiatives, similar to what Australia has done by passing a law to ban social media for those under age 16 very recently. But I don't want to focus on the systemic angle right now. I want to instead talk about what parents can do for their children and what older Gen Z or any Gen Z for that matter can do for themselves. As parents, actively try to find things for your kids to do that they find engaging outside of phones and screens. Ideally, things they can do with their hands. This could be gardening, cooking, uh, cleaning, pottery, martial arts, playing an instrument. Trust me, as a guitar player, I've spent hours learning that stuff, and it's made a huge difference to the way that I see the world and the way that I conceive things. The ability to sit and focus on one thing for a long time. It comes, it happens very naturally when you do things with your hands. And this, again, there's a lot of data which says that it allows your brains to be at rest and develop the ability to be completely engaged in the present moment, which is the opposite of anxiety, right? Another thing that you can do is to delay giving your kids access to a phone as much as possible. I know it's hard, but you have to figure out a way to make that happen. And keep an eye on the online activity as well, because there's a lot of deplorable things going on online. And the last thing you want is for your kids to be involved in some capacity or the other. And the reason I say this is because there is a lot of data which shows that kids who get smartphones earlier become adults with worse mental health. Now, that is with respect to parents, right? Now, if you're a Gen Z or older Gen Z or whatever you want to call yourself, who's been experiencing anxiety or other mental health issues, speak about it to someone. Find a therapist or a coach. There is data which says that about 2 out of 5 Gen Zers, that's 40% or so, at least in the West, are actively working with a therapist or someone. So you can do the same as well, because they will help you work on your ability to be present and regulate your emotions. Couple of other things that you can do which are very straightforward for the typical person but maybe hard for you to do if you're not used to it is to get your body moving and build real world connections. Disconnect from dating apps for a while at least and put the phone down, because those things, I will talk about the harms of dating apps in an episode I'll be doing a few weeks later on how dating has evolved across generations. But I would say please disconnect from dating apps for a while and put the phone down. These are some ideas that I have, Goldie. I'm sure you have plenty, I'm sure. I want to hear at least a few.
I think the common objective here that I pick up from your dialogue, Lakshan, is put the phone down. And before doing that, though, I want to go back to the phases in which this anxious generation leads you to become. So I'm going to go actually to the last thing that happens to you, which is addiction. You mentioned it earlier in your narrative. Number 3 would be attention fragmentation. Number 2 would be sleep deprivation. And number 1 would be social deprivation. Now, before deciding which category you fall under, because that's the most important thing, diagnosis. Yeah. If you are already in addiction mode, which is probably where a lot of the elder Gen Z are in, I'm assuming because they're grown adults, most of them, 19, 20 years of age. Well, there is a wonderful technique that I personally use with my clients, which is called the dopamine fast. And it's actually based on a book that I read some years ago, which I'm going to mention. It's called Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. So what she does is she talks about the effect of dopamine in high doses on your brain and how a deprivation of it in very quick spurts can also lead you to having these forms of anxiety. Okay. She's spoken about it years before even Jonathan Haidt brought his data forward, which was only this year. However, before that, before Anna, in between Anna and between Jonathan, Johan Hari, who's also a very well-known author, he wrote a book about a year and a half ago, I think, which is called Stolen Focus. Okay. Now, both these books, the predominant sort of the trending topic that they all address is the effects of dopamine on your brain if not regulated in the right manner. So I'm inviting all people who are identifying an addiction to their phones to address this by thinking about their dopamine levels and where are they getting their hits from. Okay, that's one very classic way of addressing this. The dopamine fast is a simple 30-day process, which if you can do with a coach, that would be wonderful. It works. I've done it myself. I've done it with my daughter. And then I think another thing that's really important is for younger teenagers who will eventually get access to social media, obviously, because at 16, a lot of countries are allowing them to access. But before they get to 16, here's a thought. What about giving them some lessons in the classic sense of IT workshops to make them understand what is it that social platforms are offering? So some education in social media. And it sounds like an absurd thing to say, but the truth is, if you're not educated in how to use social media, you're going to misuse it. Right? And so this comes under the category of education and not solution focused. It's prevention before solution. So there's two sides of the same coin that I'm, proposing. Of course, there's so many other, ideas that I can offer, but the end game is that social media is no longer social. It's actually hypnotical. That's what I see it as. It's a hypnotic effect, and you don't want to fall into the traps of being under hypnosis. If you can prevent that, be the owner of your phone, don't let the phone own you.
Yeah. I think what you mentioned at the very end about not letting the phone own you, I think it's a great way to move towards the conclusion of this episode. Because the point of this episode is not to bash on social media or technology. Because social media and technology are wonderful things, but only if you use them the way they're meant to be used as tools. Right? What you basically said, Goldie. It's very easy for all of us to blame tech companies and CEOs in the media and fear mongers and governments and everybody else under the sun, saying it's your fault that all this is happening. And that may be true, but it doesn't matter. Because no matter whose fault all this is, if it's affecting us, it's our responsibility to do something about it. Goldie very beautifully said, she brought up the angle of prevention, right? Taking something before it gets to the place where you have to, solve it or cure it. They say prevention is better than cure. And fortunately, there is something that we can do about all this. While we've spoken a lot about mental health amongst Gen Z, we haven't even touched on the mental health of the generation that raised them. But I'll be leaving that up to Goldie though. because I'm sure that's a whole other can of worms we'll be talking about in next week's episode. But that is an important topic for us to discuss because understanding the experience of each generation helps us understand the experience between generations, and it helps us become more empathetic and compassionate. And that's how you actually mind the gen gap. I'm not going to be cheeky in asking you to share this episode and subscribe to us and give us a 5-star rating today, like I typically do. I am instead going to ask you to share this episode because a lot of people really need this. They are yearning to be understood and yearning to be heard and yearning to be supported in any way possible. And simply sharing this episode with parents of Gen Z and Gen Z folk in general themselves would be doing them a huge favor. With that, we've come to the end of episode 16 of Mind the Gen Gap podcast. I've been your host, Lakshan.
And I've been your co host, Goldie.
Thank you so much for listening and watching and tuning in all the way to the very end.
Muchas gracias.
See you in the next one.
Hasta pronto.
Bye.